As you can tell from the title, this is about social movements in South Africa. So what is a social movement? I'd say it's at least somewhat organized. So this totally spontaneous, out of nowhere thing that sort of erupts and then disappears again, probably not a social movement. It has to continue over time. And in that ability to sustain over time, they probably come up with some sort of like rules, guiding principles, ideas in which they can govern themselves and run themselves. Find the money if they need it, those kinds of things. And then the main goal is to create change. Sometimes they're targeting governments to get them to change their policies. Sometimes, like I said, in my own work back in the United States, it was targeting companies to get them to change what they do. Sometimes it's just to get society to change its attitudes. So for instance, this HIV/AIDS movement had a really good campaign to just try and get people to stop being so ashamed of having HIV. And that was something that South Africa desperately needed at that point in time. It wasn't a governmental change. It wasn't an institution. It wasn't like some particular thing you could target. But in much the same way that the gay rights movement, I think, has been pretty effective at getting people to sort of consider them to be people by coming out over the process over time and making sure that there's a lot of gay faces in front of people that people get exposed to. For instance, I'm one of them. Hi, guys. It's stuff like that that actually ends up creating change in societies, or at least so we hope. What isn't a social movement? Political parties, kind of borderline. Sometimes social movements turn into political parties. Violent rebellions, again, kind of borderline. Once you get to the point where you're basically in like full-out revolt with like armed conflict, probably not so much a social movement anymore. Probably actually fighting a war. Spontaneous riots, like I said, again, probably not. Not sustained, doesn't have any organization to it, probably doesn't have any sort of common ideology. So famous social movements around the world, to give this a bit of context, the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa to try and end discrimination against non-white people in a country of, at that time, about 40 million people, that's a pretty famous one. The civil rights movement in the United States that Martin Luther King was a part of, or on the sort of more militant side, Malcolm X, Huey Newton, also a social movement. The Occupy movement, potentially a social movement. I think that's fair to call them one. The Arab Spring, a lot of those movements, social movements. These are groups of people who come together with a common ideology to try and change whatever is going on in their society. So South African history. There's a bunch of different native groups that existed in South Africa before anybody with skin color like mine rocked up. That didn't happen until 1652. And prior to that, you had different groups that were sort of battling each other, sometimes via sort of trades and acquisitions, sometimes via outright, violent skirmishes, to get land from each other. So it's not as though South Africa was a sort of peaceful, settled place before the colonizers turned up. The thing that changed when the colonizers turned up is that they arrived with sort of a scale of military that was totally unseen in that area of the continent before. So when you turn up to deal with a bunch of people who don't have things like all of the sort of like wild weaponry that the Dutch turned up with, it makes it pretty easy to conquer a group of people. It has nothing to do with whether or not they themselves are like strong in character, strong in body. It has everything to do with basically who had more firepower at the time. And this is a bit of an oversimplification because they also did all kinds of dastardly things like convincing chiefs to trade away like various other groups in order to be able to gain more power. So there are some bad guys, on the sort of native side of this conflict as well. But it's fair to say probably most of the bad guys were probably Dutch for a while. Then the British turned up. And so then the bad guys were also British. And there's a couple of different groups that were pretty effective at fighting both Britain and the Dutch. The Zulu people in particular, led by this very fierce warrior named Shaka Zulu. did a pretty good job of like handing the Dutch their tails in battle after battle, despite being at a massive technological disadvantage. But eventually the Dutch and the British pretty much take over the entirety of what we know as South Africa. They sort of split off into different areas of it, and then eventually the British decide that they're sort of sick of the Dutch having any of it, and they go to war with the Dutch. They have much more superiority in terms of technology, organization, people on the ground than the Dutch do. So they basically win the war. So they form a unified country of South Africa in 1910. Throughout all of this period, both the British and Dutch administrations and then individual British and Dutch settlers are taking land out from under the people who were in this country before them. So the start of the Union of South Africa, you can see what's going on here, right? So there's this giant province at the bottom called the Cape. That is what the British were in charge of before South Africa was unified. They had sort of forced the Dutch further and further inward. So people landed at this like far point over here, the Cape of Good Hope, which people initially thought was like the furthest south point in Africa. And then, you know, the Dutch sort of go further inward. And so if you were able to read this map, you'd see a bunch of sort of Dutch-sounding names like towards the center of the country. All of these sort of colored bits you see in the white, with the exception of that gray one right there, are places that as of 1913 were pretty much the only places you were allowed to live if you were black in South Africa. So you went from having an entire country, some of it was probably under your control, some of it might be under like your rivaling neighbor's control, but it was still your country, to having these tiny pieces of land that have just been carved out by the white settlers as the places you're allowed to live. As the point says, it ends up restricting 87% of the land to whites, who at that point are only 20% of the people in the country. Everybody else has to live in these tiny little reserves, also called Bantustans or homelands. And eventually the South African government says, okay, these are self-governing. These aren't a part of South Africa anymore. We actually, as a part of our like racial ideology, think that we are the chosen people of South Africa, the white folks who turned up, mostly the Dutch. And we actually just don't think that you have a rightful claim to any of these areas. Notably, all of the resources are concentrated in the areas in the map that are marked white. So all of the gold mines, all of the diamond mines, those are in the white areas. And the reason the British sort of let this happen, they didn't have the same racial ideology, but it actually made it a lot easier for them to get people to work in those diamond mines and those gold mines. So you force them onto these tiny little pieces of land. You make the tiny pieces of land pay you taxes in cash, right? So now you actually have to have cash in this economy. And how are you going to get the cash? Well, by working for the Dutch or for the British, who happen to run all of the companies in the country. There aren't really other opportunities to be able to make money to pay your tax. And if you don't pay your tax, you get thrown in jail. So the party that I described that has this really intense racial ideology is a group called the National Party. And they are a group of Dutch folks who subscribe to a particular church called the Dutch Reformed Church, which is a very different kind of church in South Africa than it is in the Netherlands. So like if you have a friend who's Dutch and belongs to the Dutch Reformed Church, don't immediately assume that they're like, you know, an architect of apartheid. They probably aren't. I'm not going to say they definitely aren't because I don't know your friend, but if they're your friend, I'm going to assume they're not. The official start of apartheid is in 1948. So up until then, there's been all kinds of racist stuff going on, but there hasn't been this explicit state ideology, like state policy, talking about the ways in which they want to make sure that the white areas are for whites only, the black areas are for blacks only. And then there's another category that South Africa sort of created called coloreds, which is also still in use today. And that describes anybody who is either of mixed race. So if you had like one white parent and one black parent, you'd get classified as colored. It's anybody who falls into the group of Cape Malay, because the Dutch imported a bunch of slaves from Malaysia, who are at this point predominantly Muslim and neither as dark in skin tone as the Africans who existed on the continent before them, but nor as pale as the Dutch colonizers. And these categories are incredibly fluid. The South African government categorizes you based on basically looking at you. And if it's a tough case, right, if they're like, I actually don't quite know what color you are, then they do things like putting a pencil in your hair. And if it falls out, you're probably colored. If it doesn't fall out, you're black. That's how scientific this was. And just to tell you about like the effects that this had, right, it's almost comical. If it weren't for the fact that that category determined where you could work, where you could live, who you could marry, whether you could vote. Like the entirety of your life hinges on these like stupid bureaucratic tests that are obviously deeply racist in the ways in which they're carried out. But they have so much say as to what exactly happens to you over the course of your life. And there were points in time where, you lose your pass card, like your government-issued ID. You have to go in and get a new one. You've been colored all your life, and because you ran into the wrong bureaucrat, all of a sudden you're black. You have to move, your marriage is illegal, and you can't hold the job that you used to hold before. And the reason that you can't hold that job before is they check these pass cards. So as of a little further into the apartheid era, you have to show your ID no matter when you want to go from any of those like sort of colored regions that I showed you before, like the ones that were colored on the map, into the areas that were white. You had to show them to go from like the outskirts of the city where people were allowed to live in order to be servants for the people in the city, or to run the businesses, like the really bad, like crappy job side of the businesses in the city. You had to show those in order to say, I, Stephanie Bell, am justified in being in this area. And if I didn't have something that said that my job was in that area and I had a justification for being there, they threw me in jail. Sometimes they threw me in jail anyways because they were bored, because they didn't like the way I was walking. Sometimes they threw me in jail because of the fact that I was like not sufficiently deferential to them. So at this point, you just sort of have a circulation of South African men in particular in and out of jails, which ends up becoming a pretty critical thing for the anti-apartheid struggle, because you also get all of these political activists who are thrown in jail. Note that when I say that what you could say or advocate is something that the apartheid government controls, that means that they also get the opportunity to do things like ban political parties. So for instance, Nelson Mandela's party, the African National Congress, which is now in charge of South Africa, that was banned from pretty early in the 60s onwards. And Mandela was thrown in jail from pretty early in the 60s onwards for saying things like, we think that blacks should have the right to vote, we should be equals in this society, you took our country from us and now we're prisoners in our own land. So these are all pretty serious things going on here. So this is basically the timeline that happens during the actual apartheid era. So in the 1948 to 1960, it's pretty difficult to get the kind of ground level organization to actually fight against apartheid. The Afrikaners, first off, those are the Dutch folks who settled in Africa. They call themselves Afrikaners. And the sort of like apartheid ideology takes a little while to get itself set up, then eventually foments and sort of forces people into such resistance that by the 1960s and 70s, they can't just keep it alive by throwing people into jail. They're having to be out in the streets, shooting at people, beating people up, and making lots of political arrests. There was an island just off the shore of Cape Town called Robben Island where Nelson Mandela was held for almost 30 years. And was supposed to be held for the rest of his life if there hadn't been a change in the government that allowed him to be free. He and a bunch of other political prisoners were like literally isolated from the rest of the country to the point where nobody else was allowed on that island. Only their lawyers, and only sometimes. And so the 1960s and 70s start getting pretty hectic. The 1960s, there's this terrible incident called the Sharpsville Massacre in which people start protesting these pass laws, the ones I said that control whether or not you can go to certain places, and it's like your ID book. It has your racial categorization, it says where you're allowed to go. They protest these at a place called Sharpsville, and they're unarmed, right? Eventually they get to the point where they start throwing stones, and the police, who are behind a fence that is stopping all of the stones, open fire on the entirety of the crowd. They end up killing somewhere between like 60 and 100 people. There's not an exact tally. In the 1970s, there's another major sort of like pivotal point in South African history called the Soweto Uprising, which I have a video of just after this slide, which is a group of students who are now being forced to learn in Afrikaans, which is the sort of like language of the Dutch folks who created the National Party. It's this sort of melange or combination of both Dutch, English, and then a lot of the different African languages that already existed. So a lot of black students are being forced to learn in a language that not only isn't theirs, and that they don't speak very well, and that their teachers don't speak very well. It's the language of their very oppressors, and they just consider this to be such an affront that they eventually, in 1976, June 1976, start a peaceful protest on the streets of Soweto, which is a very large black township just outside of Johannesburg, the biggest city in South Africa. And this protest also ends up turning incredibly violent, not because the students started throwing stones, but because the police got trigger happy before there was any violence from the students' parts. And this is, students who are your age and younger. People were there at the age of like 13. The police start firing on this crowd of students. They end up killing several dozen students on the day. all black students protesting against having to learn this particular language in their schools and to be taught in this language in their schools, which means that they actually can't learn things like math, because they don't speak Afrikaans well enough to learn math. If it's, an Afrikaans-speaking math teacher. It also kicks off a series of riots that then last for months, in which hundreds more people are killed. This is an event that's hugely important in the collective memory of South Africa, because it's a demonstration both of the power that youth has. It's actually a turning point in the ways in which the apartheid government treats blacks and coloreds, but also a sort of, a very important point to remember in terms of the actual atrocities that were committed over the course of apartheid. In the 1980s, this ramps up even further, and you get this call for what's known as ungovernability, to take all of the black areas that are in white areas, right? So you have those black perimeters of the white cities. Remember I mentioned like the townships like Soweto? Turn all of those into places that actually the police just can't go into. Light tires on fire in the streets to keep them from getting across barricades, throw stones the instant they dare to set foot in places like Soweto or Alexandra, which is another township, or Khayelitsha, the list goes on, and just make it so that way the police can't actually control you. And also make it so obvious that there is a civil war that is about to break out in this country, that the apartheid government has to do something about it. It also draws a lot of international attention to what's going on in the country as a result of the fact that South Africa is literally on fire at this point. And you're seeing this video footage from some pretty daring reporters of people getting shot in the street for what appears to be doing basically doing nothing, other than being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And the people who are doing the shooting have white skin, and the people who are dying as a result of it have black skin. It's a pretty horrifying and terrible image that I actually thought about whether or not to include a video in here and decided against it, because it's actually just really rough, for obvious reasons. And the international community starts condemning South Africa. They put economic sanctions on them, don't let them trade anything anywhere else, and refuse to let goods go to South Africa. But that wouldn't have kicked up if it weren't for the fact that people were protesting all the time in the streets, such that international attention happened. So South Africa realizes they don't have the military to be able to do this, basically. They're drafting every single white person who's of military age, and they still don't have the military to handle what's going on in the townships and in these areas that have now become ungovernable. So between that and the economic pressure that's being laid down on them from the entirety of the international community almost at this point, they decide to unban the ANC. They let Mandela out of jail in 1992, and they start holding discussions about how to have a peaceful transition from this horribly racist, oppressive government that was run by the National Party into something that resembles free and fair elections, which is what happens in 1994. And since then, the ANC has been in charge. That's Mandela's party. They keep getting elected by a landslide. Things weren't perfect in South Africa at the time, and they aren't now. As a result, as you can see by some of these statistics here, there was just this tremendous sense of possibility in 1994 that for many people hasn't gone away. There's a faith in the ability to actually affect giant, large-scale, globally important political processes through your own participation in social movements, which were one of the major things that ended up bringing down apartheid. The international sanctions wouldn't have existed if there weren't those organized movements on the ground to make sure that the international community knew what was happening in terms of the abuse in South Africa. So South Africa today, the ANC is still in charge. They were elected in a landslide in that 1994 election. And they've continued to be elected in a landslide in every election since. They've held elections every 5 years or so. Nelson Mandela stepped down after 2 terms. Thabo Mbeki was the next president. He stepped down after 2 terms. The current president is a fellow named Jacob Zuma, who it looks like is going to get reelected for a 2nd term, and then presumably he's going to step down as well. And throughout all of this, the opposition party has been gaining steam. It barely existed in 1994 because if you were in opposition to the ANC, most people just sort of assumed that you were a racist. But as there's, and so, racists voted for the old National Party, which had barely sort of, changed its colors in the slightest, was still promoting the same kinds of policies. But at this point, there's an increasingly robust opposition in South Africa that's holding the ANC to account to make sure that they actually do what they say they're going to do in their political promises. There's now just over 50 million people in the country. It's effectively 90% non-white. but whites still hold the vast majority of capital and the sort of economic engines of the country. You have an increasingly empowered black middle class through those policies that I was talking about yesterday, those sort of black empowerment policies in which they sort of take into account what your levels of historical disadvantage are based on race, but also based on things like gender and poverty. And those kinds of things. And then they try and figure out sort of, how can we elevate those people to the highest positions that they're skilled to hold? And how can we make sure they have the skills to hold the highest positions possible? Average life expectancy is around 60 years. 91% of people have access to tap water in their housing. Under apartheid, that number was somewhere around 80. 85% have electricity in their housing. Under apartheid, that number was about 42. So the ANC has made some massive gains, and over 90% of people in South Africa have some level of schooling. 75% have finished primary school. Again, these are huge improvements, which isn't to say that the ANC has done a perfect job running the country. There's issues with corruption. In particular, there's issues with corruption that go to the highest levels of the party. Jacob Zuma has been pretty strongly implicated in them, the current president. He's basically known to be guilty, but for the sake of sort of not rocking the boat, he hasn't really gone to a proper trial. And there also are some serious issues with the ways in which, government projects are allocated to different contractors, like there's corruption there. And there's just massive challenges to overcome as a result of what apartheid looked like and what it did to people. When you separate 80% of the country into these tiny little areas and cut them off from all kind of economic opportunities and intentionally give them bad schooling to ensure that they can't rise above their current existence, which is exactly what the apartheid government did. It's a lot of challenges to overcome. And this last number here, 5.7 million people, or somewhere around 18% of the adults in the country, are living with HIV/AIDS. In 1998, that number was sitting at around 1.9 million. And between 1998 and now, that's only 15 years ago, that number has quadrupled. And that's the result of some very bad policy decisions by the president who followed Nelson Mandela. So to shift then to talk about what those policy decisions looked like and how people resisted them is this organization called the Treatment Action Campaign, who I had the privilege of working with as a volunteer for about 6 months at both their national office and then in a township just outside Cape Town called Khayelitsha, which is a lot of sort of informal settlements like shack housing and that kind of thing, but also has a lot of sort of formal service structures like clinics present to be able to allow people to get medicines. So the Treatment Action Campaign comes into existence when that 1.8 million, 1.9 million statistic is true. Immediately following the creation of this group, which is created because poor people in the country don't have access to life-saving antiretroviral medications, or ARVs for short, which are now widely available globally. And people in countries like the United States have had them for 6 or 7 years, and things are going really well. South Africa is steadfastly refusing to provide these medications in the public sector to anyone, as a result of the president having a very specific sort of belief system that makes him deny the link between HIV and AIDS. And nobody knows quite why he did it. Maybe it was for economic reasons, because a full-scale rollout of all of this would be tremendously expensive. Maybe it was because he had some particular beliefs regarding traditional medicine and Western science. Maybe it was because there's this constant sort of media portrayal of black sexuality, particularly in Africa, as being this sort of rampant, rapacious thing. And the idea that South Africa had an AIDS problem only played into that narrative. Nobody knows for sure why he decides to reject the proven science on this, and this is definitively proven science. But if you don't believe that HIV, which is the virus itself, causes AIDS, which is sort of what happens to your body as a result of having the virus, then you don't have to provide the drugs that treat the virus, which is exactly the logic he offered. Instead of treating with HIV/AIDS drugs, he suggested, through his public health minister, that people should treat HIV with a treatment of beetroot, lemon juice, and garlic, which hopefully you guys know does not treat HIV. In 2008, a new president comes in, that's Jacob Zuma. He also has a dodgy record on this issue, but knows well enough, based on what happened to his predecessor and how vilified he became in the press through the work of this group of activists, that there was no way that he could get away with not providing this HIV/AIDS drug. And even at the end of Mbeki, the denialist president, at the end of his term, the Treatment Action Campaign is getting a lot of success in getting those drugs put into the public sector. In particular, getting drugs, for instance, that prevent mother-to-child transmission. So if a mother is pregnant, she has a baby, there's a pretty high chance that that child is going to be born with HIV. But we have drugs to stop that. President Mbeki didn't want those to be used in the public sector because, again, he didn't believe that HIV caused AIDS. That was his official stance. But the Treatment Action Campaign sued the government of South Africa and won to ensure that that would happen, that those treatments would occur. So the Treatment Action Campaign ended up, at the time of its sort of height, being, hundreds of thousands of members strong. It was the biggest social movement in South Africa since the end of apartheid. And they were constantly in the press. If you said the Treatment Action Campaign to most sort of, knowledgeable, like people who read the news South Africans, they'd know exactly who you were talking about. And they were constantly coming up with, creative and increasingly aggressive strategies to try and make sure that the president was actually held to account. So they held public protests and marches, much like the way in which the students back in Soweto held the marches to try and call attention to issues. But a lot of times these weren't effective. So they also sued in the newly created South African Constitutional Court for provision of these drugs through the public system. Both for the prevention of mother-to-child transmission, for the treatment of prisoners who were living with HIV/AIDS, and also for access to drugs that were currently not accepted by the South African sort of Medicines Control Council, the group of scientists who decide whether or not a drug is safe and can come into the country. And they were successful in all of these suits. But they also sort of decided, well, we aren't going to be able to do this by just, suing and protesting. We're going to go to international conferences and make you all look like fools. Mbeki was not known as, a good technocrat who ran South Africa well, which on every other issue is probably true. Mbeki was known as the guy who didn't believe that HIV caused AIDS, and he was an international laughingstock for it. It took a serious toll on his public reputation. And they also used civil disobedience. One of the leaders of this movement who had some wealth, but thought that it was unacceptable for him to be able to take HIV drugs when other people didn't have access to them, he flew to Thailand and he bought some of the medicines that weren't currently allowed in South Africa and weren't provided in South Africa. And he bought them in massive quantities. And then he just imported them to South Africa, which, if you think about it, is very literally drug smuggling. These drugs are not allowed in South Africa, and he brings them there. So of course he gets to the airport. He has this huge publicity stunt saying, look, I've brought all the medicines that we actually need. You guys should be thanking me, but I'm pretty sure you're going to arrest me. And that's exactly what happened. They arrested him. And they also had sit-ins in government offices to sort of call attention to this issue and to try and get somebody within government. Because keep in mind, the ANC is in a parliamentary government, so party members only get advanced through the ranks and get higher positions in government by sucking up to the guys who are in charge and being loyal and that kind of thing. If the guys in charge don't like you, you don't move up. So nobody's speaking out on this issue. The two ministers who did decide to speak out were two women who then plummeted in the ranks of the ANC under Thabo Mbeki. They went from being sort of, government minister level to being at the very bottom of the party roll. And the only reason they were still in parliament at all is because it would have been too obvious to remove them completely. So he created these trumped up corruption charges and then threw them out of their ministry positions. But they didn't just focus on government. I told you that one of the ways social movements can work is they can change social perceptions. So the anti-apartheid struggle did a really good job of persuading college students in places like the United States, the UK, sort of the global north, to say, this is actually an atrocity that's happening here, and we want our governments to pressure people. This group did the same thing, and so protests were held around the world against the South African embassies, with people walking around holding lemons and saying things like, Montu, Montu, and that's the health minister, can't you see? Lemons are not ARVs, which is the drug, and it just makes them look absolutely ridiculous. But they also did kinds of really targeted education campaigns. So this treatment literacy point up here is to say, okay, the government isn't providing you the medications you need to deal with your condition, at least not in full. But here's what they do provide you to deal with the conditions that you have. So frequently people would have tuberculosis alongside HIV because it weakens your immune system. It makes you more susceptible to get other diseases. And so they'd go out into these very rural communities and they'd have peer educators, not some doctor in a white coat who looks really unapproachable, but one of your neighbors is going to be talking to you about how HIV works in the body and the science of HIV, explained in sort of colloquial language that people understand. And so when I was doing my research in South Africa, I literally was asking fourth graders, can you tell me how HIV works? So these are 10-year-olds maybe. And getting like descriptions of this that are far better than American college students would be able to tell me, right? Like that's the level of scientific literacy and knowledge about this disease that existed throughout South Africa as a result of this campaign. They also destigmatized the disease. They wore these shirts, if you can see them, that said HIV positive, and all of the members of the campaign wore the shirts, whether they were HIV positive or not. Because the whole idea is that it shouldn't matter if you're HIV positive. You shouldn't be treated any differently by your neighbors if you're HIV positive. You shouldn't be rejected from going into shops if you're HIV positive. But things like that were happening to people as a result of being HIV positive. And one of the things this group did phenomenally was to sort of say, look, 5.7 million people in this country are HIV positive. It's your neighbors, it's your relatives, it's your friends. And the people you're treating so badly as a result of them having this disease, many of whom got it not because they made bad decisions, but because the institutions and structural violence in South Africa, like the inability of women to negotiate whether or not they want to have sex or whether or not they want to have a condom used, like in a patriarchal society can be very difficult. And so if we're shaming all of these people, we're shaming people, A, for having made like one bad decision at some point in their life that is now, for many of these people, a death sentence, so maybe we can be compassionate. But B, there's a lot of people who also didn't even make that bad decision. It was made for them. They were raped, they didn't get the opportunity to make that decision, the condom broke. Let's actually just treat other humans as other humans. They also went about working with traditional healers, so like the people who weren't Western medicine practitioners, to sort of say, okay, you guys can probably be really good at treating some of the symptoms of HIV. So for instance, if you get like really bad nausea as a result of being HIV positive, which happens sometimes. But if you want to actually treat the thing that causes all of that, you should send those people to a Western clinic too. So once the medicines became available, this group has now built this wonderful network with practitioners of traditional healing to say like, okay, I turn up to the clinic, it looks like I have HIV/AIDS symptoms, you can give me stuff to deal with my symptoms, but then you're also going to send me off to the clinic to get the drug to deal with like the underlying problem, which is also something that wouldn't have existed without these guys. And this movement was born of people fighting for their lives, literally, and fighting for the lives of those around them. Thabo Mbeki's AIDS policies killed somewhere between 350,000 and 400,000 people. You can't put a number on that for sure because you don't know exactly how the drugs were going to work for everyone. But most epidemiologists and people who study this stuff realize that that's actually pretty important, and that's like an accurate number. That, for the record, is 2 Oxfords. It's 2/3 of the state of Wyoming. It's the size of the hometown that I grew up in, which is the capital of the state of Iowa. That's an incredible number of people to have died in such a short time from something that was genuinely preventable. And so as a result of tax work, HIV/AIDS is much less stigmatized, which isn't to say there's no stigma, but it's a lot better these days. The court cases were always won for TAC. I don't think they lost a single case over the course of all of this. They forced the public health system to start providing these ARV drugs, these AIDS drugs in the public system before Mbeki's presidency ended, which is a huge victory, because that's the guy who doesn't believe HIV causes AIDS. And as of today, 2 million people are on HIV/AIDS drugs. South Africa has more people in the public sector on HIV/AIDS drugs than any other country in the world. And that's a tremendous triumph for which the present government, Zuma's government, should be incredibly proud, and so should TAC. So second group I want to talk to you about is a group that was actually spun off of this HIV/AIDS movement. They sort of said, you know, we've won a lot of the battles here, but there are battles to be fought in other sectors. You know, apartheid screwed things up really badly in a lot of different ways. And one of the things that did that is this thing called the Bantu Education Act, passed by the apartheid government to limit the access of black students and colored students to high-quality schools. It created separate and unequal school systems, definitively unequal school systems. They didn't even try and pretend that this was equal. It made schooling more widely available for people, but it also intentionally kept people from learning things that would allow them to be able to challenge the government in a good way. And this was all sort of packaged as, well, we're just teaching you the skills that you need for the jobs that you're going to be able to get. But of course, the jobs that they were able to get, the only jobs they were allowed to have by law, were things like domestic workers, people who gardened, mine workers, very sort of like low-skilled labor jobs, which means that the education they were provided was nearly non-existent. And so in 2008, this treatment action campaign group was led by a pretty charismatic activist, a guy named Zaki Ahmed, who has since gone on to found several different activist movements, all of which are quite successful. And one of them was about education. So this is a student movement that currently exists in South Africa that is big enough and strong enough to be able to turn out about 20,000 people to protests when they want to. And that's no small number of people. That, like, you turn up to Parliament with 20,000 people and you're like queue along a very wide street. All of your sea of faces stretches for miles. It's an incredible number. So they ran several different campaigns. And equal education has had a harder job than the treatment action campaign because it's not particularly clear what you should do first to fix the South African school system. With HIV, it's relatively simple. You treat people. If you can treat people with HIV/AIDS drugs, you can reduce the frequency with which HIV is transmitted. So that means you have fewer people in the country who have it. You make sure people aren't dying from it. They're leading longer and healthier lives. Science tells us that, and that one's an easy fix. It's what in the policy world could be called a silver bullet. It's the thing that works no matter what. Equal education, on the other hand, has been faced with this mess of a South African school system, and it's sort of like, well, what do we do? I mean, we aren't experts in this. We must be able to figure out something, though. And the solution they hit on is that rather than say we disagree with government policy, they say we disagree with government's implementation of their own policy. There's nothing in government policy that they see as that problematic, right? They sort of say, like, okay, these seem like they're sort of smart ideas. We just want you to actually go and do them, right? Like you tell us that our school should be in X condition or Y condition, and we get to school and they're shambles. So how about you actually just do your jobs? So they're almost like an accountability movement that's focused on the South African Education Ministry and the sort of different layers of South African education to get them to actually be in good shape. So the first campaign was literally just to fix broken windows in schools in Khayelitsha, which is this township outside Cape Town. They had a sort of popular campaign about late coming because a lot of their fellow students were turning up to class late, and a lot of their teachers were turning up to class late. So they said, okay, well, a lot of the students are like, well, why should we be on time? Like, none of our teachers are here, so waste of our time, not going to bother. And they said, well, look, like, if we all turn up on time, then we can make our teachers look really bad for not turning up on time. And we have a lot of public support, right? Like, we're a bunch of students in school uniforms waiting outside the gates of our own schools, waiting for the doors of learning to be opened. And nobody's there to open them. That's a pretty powerful image. And it makes the teachers look really bad. So this late coming campaign not only reduced sort of absenteeism among students, it also meant that all of the teachers started turning up on time, at least for a while. They had a school libraries campaign because 90% of schools, just over 90% of schools in South Africa don't have access to a school library. And that 20,000 person march I told you about was mostly students who wanted to just have a library in their own school. And so they marched on Parliament to demand that there was actually a provision for school libraries. And the reason this is so important is because, well, obviously you can't do your research if you don't have books, but also if you want to find a book, maybe you could go to your public library, maybe that's a solution. But students were getting mugged trying to do their research reports and trying to do their academic work because they were traveling to libraries after dark, and they were getting mugged and attacked because they were easy targets. So you weren't able to do your schoolwork if you didn't have the books in your school. So that was something they fought for. And this last thing is their current campaign. It's norms and standards for school infrastructure, which sounds sort of complex. But the general idea is that the South African education minister said that there should be some sort of, basic standards in law for what is a school in South Africa. Like, what has to be present for us to call this thing a school? How big should the spaces be? How many students should there be in each classroom? how many, simple as things like toilets being provided for students to ensure that they actually have access to clean sanitation. And some of these schools that exist in really rural areas are literally made of mud. The roofs are caving in on them, and the wind in the winter, which is actually pretty cold in South Africa, whips straight through them. And so if you can imagine trying to hold a class outside in winter and not ever being able to go to the bathroom, plus having to share your desk with another student who is maybe somewhat bigger than you, so you actually only have this much space to sit on and this much space to write on. It's really hard conditions for anybody to learn in, or for that matter, for anybody to teach in. So that's what they fought for. And so this picture right here, this guy is Thabo Makgoba. He is the current Archbishop of the Anglican Church in South Africa. So he has the role that Desmond Tutu used to have. And he's this sort of powerful moral authority that people tremendously respect in the country. And if he's sitting there in schools that look like that, but the desks are broken, there's a hole in the wall behind him, and this bookcase over here that's supposed to be holding the workbooks is falling apart and leaks water, so all of them are destroyed. That's the sort of thing that makes people go, maybe we need to pay more attention to this issue. And so much like their predecessors in the Treatment Action Campaign, this group of students now has seized the popular media and imagination. And whenever somebody writes about education in South Africa, they turn to Equal Education and say, well, what do you guys think about this? And their quotes are constantly in the major newspapers. It's like the equivalent of running a student movement that one of you started, and then if you were American, landing in the New York Times every single time there was an issue that related to your particular movement. They also have done a lot of research into schools in South Africa, and one of the things they do is they hold youth groups to make sure that everybody is up to date on the latest of what's going on in South African policy, but also about the research that actually happens on education and how to fix it. And so they'll get together once a week or once every 2 weeks and sort of have these youth discussions that are facilitated by people who have come up through the movement and mostly are now in college. To sort of say, we want to know our facts and our data. So that way, if the minister ever comes to one of us and is like, all right, blind follower, why do you actually care about this? Which she has done. You can say, well, I care about this because 92 or 93% of schools in South Africa don't have libraries, and 95% of them don't have science laboratories. And how am I supposed to be an engineer if I can never get to a science laboratory in my school when I'm in high school? That's the kinds of statements that they're able to give. And then they also have court cases on this minimum norms and standards. They took the minister to court, just like they said they would in that video. And she settled. She said, OK, we're on this. We'll create these minimum norms and standards, and we'll put them in place by this date. You'll get the opportunity for public comment. So if there's any issues with them, you can say so. And then we'll put them into law. And the minister didn't obey the settlement. So despite the fact that she agreed in a court to say that she was going to do this, she then defaulted on her agreement. Unfortunately, there wasn't a court order in place to say, well, you have to do this. Because usually when there's a settlement, people sort of are like, oh, yeah, we're all on the same page here. This is good. And so Equal Education had to take her back to court again this year to say, we want a court order demanding that you do this thing that you've already agreed you're going to do, and that we know we have the resources for in the country. Studies have been done. We can pay for these improvements. And the minister's just not doing them. So that there is actually one of the limitations of social movements. You yourselves don't have power. Equal Education, in the same way that the minister has power. You have power in terms of making her look terrible. You have power in terms of demonstrating that she's wrong. You have power in terms of getting people to vote her out the next cycle. But you can't actually fix the schools yourselves. And they've sort of tried to demonstrate that actually we do have a lot of power. That whole school libraries campaign, they just started putting libraries in South African schools. They're like, this actually just can't be that hard. We can get a bunch of donated books. We'll start collaborating with publishers and bookshops and individual volunteers, and we'll just start putting libraries in schools that don't have them. And to date, they've put about 20 libraries in schools around Cape Town, which is no small feat over the last 3 years or so. But 20 libraries over 3 years is nowhere near what a government could do if they decided to take up the same issue. So like I said, the outcomes, you've got the Broken Windows campaign that has more than the needed money to actually fix those schools. But that was almost like a token gesture from government. They're like, OK, you've made a really big deal out of this school that you've shown a photo of with all of the windows knocked out of it. So we're going to give a lot of money to Luhlaza High. And they're going to be able to fix their school. But we're going to ignore the rest of them. They succeeded in the Late Coming campaign, the school libraries campaign. They had their own libraries set up, and they got some provincial governments to agree to set up libraries. But the Norms and Standards campaign is still up in the air. And it's not clear whether the minister is actually going to do it, despite having agreed. And even if she does agree to it, it's just a set of words on a page that are law. But words on a page that are law sometimes don't mean things that actually happen in the world. So in the case of the treatment action campaign, getting the laws in place to get those medicines delivered, they've been pretty successful. But there's still sometimes shortages in clinics that mean that people can't get their drugs on time. And that's a huge problem because these treatments are things that are very specific about when you have to take your drugs. And that's when you have a minister who's actually trying. On this one, the minister has been nothing but resistant and has said sort of, well, this isn't my problem. Go talk to your provincial governments. And the provincial governments say, well, this isn't my problem. Go talk to your national minister. It's unclear how you're actually going to be able to solve that problem. So just some general social movement strategies that I think are pretty common. Not all movements use these, but they're standard. Awareness raising. So just sort of to be like, look, this is an issue, right? So like global climate change and global warming is something that there's been a lot of awareness raising movements about, just to try and get people like me to not leave my light on when I leave my bedroom for the rest of the day, or to sort of get elected officials to pay attention to an issue. There's appeals to higher authorities. So in the case of this education minister, you sort of appeal to her boss and you say, well, look, Mr. President, like this needs to change. And there's actually some friendly support within the presidency for the kinds of arguments that equal education is making. But that can only go so far if he doesn't want to force it. Or you can appeal to like the UN or international sort of groups that can have a lot of influence, which is what happened in the anti-apartheid movement. They sort of said, look, the international community has to boycott South Africa, or it's never going, this apartheid system is not going to end. We've been fighting on the streets for our lives and our livelihood here, but we can't do it without your help. And they got an international community to sort of start boycotting South Africa and sanctioning South Africa. You can educate people, whether that's educating your own members to sort of say, like, here's how you treat yourself and your own HIV and the way that AIDS syndrome is working for you. Or you can educate other people to say, like, don't stigmatize people who live with HIV, and here's why you shouldn't. So social movements can be pretty good at that. There's the shaming and moral appeals, like I said, the sort of making Thabo Mbeki look like a fool on the international stage for holding up a lemon and saying that that treats AIDS. Boycotts to say that we aren't going to support businesses or countries that are conducting themselves in these ways. And civil disobedience is the one that's sort of known as like the last possible step, but sometimes it's necessary. And actually, equal education is getting to the point where they're contemplating it. It would have been unheard of a year and a half ago when I last did my field work there, because there's a very strong consciousness of the fact that, it's a student movement, and a lot of these guys have really bright futures, and they don't necessarily want to sacrifice their ability to like get hired or to go on to university because they have this charge on their record that says that they were in violation of this law. But on the other hand, sometimes it takes drastic measures to get people to do the things that they really should have done in the first place, which is exactly why, Zaki Ahmed got arrested as a drug smuggler for bringing in the drugs from Thailand, and why those people in the treatment action campaign were getting stuffed into the back of the police van for sitting in government offices and refusing to leave until treatment was provided.